I'm Marcus Chen, 34. A quiet man who spent 8 years serving our country in places most people can't pronounce. When I came home, my family treated my service like an embarrassment, something to downplay at dinner parties. He was just following orders, my father would say with a dismissive wave whenever anyone asked about my time overseas. My sister Sarah rolled her eyes when I mentioned my unit. Even my mother changed the subject when neighbors inquired about my deployments. For 3 years, I swallowed their shame in silence, believing maybe they were right, maybe I was just another cog in the machine. The last Tuesday, everything changed when they attended the memorial dedication ceremony. When they saw my name etched in bronze among the heroes, when they learned what just following orders really meant, their world shattered. The truth about my service was about to surface, and nothing would ever be the same. Before we jump back in, tell me where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you. Make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. 3 years ago, stepped off the plane at LAX, carrying nothing but a duffel bag. And 8 years of memories I couldn't share. The fluorescent lights felt harsh after months in desert sun, and every sound seemed amplified, the rolling of suitcases, the chatter of reuniting families, the mechanical voice announcing departures to places I'd only dreamed of visiting as a tourist. My father stood near the baggage claim, checking his watch. He wore his courtroom posture, shoulders back, expression neutral, like he was waiting for a client rather than his son. When our eyes met, he managed a thin smile and a handshake that felt more professional than paternal. "Good flight?" he asked, already scanning for the exit. "Long," I replied, though I'd slept most of the way. What I meant was that the journey home had taken 8 years. It's not 8 hours. The drive to their house in Pasadena was filled with safe conversation, whether his latest case involving a contentious divorce. Nothing about where I'd been or what I'd done. Nothing about the papers folded in my jacket pocket, the ones that documented my honorable discharge and the commendations I'd earned in places whose names he couldn't pronounce. At home, my mother had prepared my favorite meal pot roast with mashed potatoes, but the portions felt childish, as if I were still the 18-year-old who'd left for basic training. Sarah arrived late, breezing in with apologies about a client meeting, her designer heels clicking against the hardwood floors I'd helped install during high school summers. "So, you're back," she said, settling into her chair with practiced efficiency. "What's the plan now?" The question hung in the air like smoke. I had saved money, had skills, had experience leading men in situations that would break most people. But sitting at that dining room table, surrounded by law degrees and marketing awards and the comfortable certainty of their civilian lives, I felt like a stranger who'd wandered into the wrong house. "I'm figuring it out," I said, cutting in two. Meat that tasted like childhood but couldn't fill the hollow space that had opened in my chest. My mother changed the subject to neighborhood gossip who had gotten married, divorced, promoted. Their world had continued spinning without me, each revelation highlighting how completely I'd been erased from their daily thoughts. When Mrs. Patterson from next door stopped by with a welcome home cake, my father introduced me as Robert's son, just back from overseas, as if my name and my service were afterthoughts. That night, lying in my childhood bedroom with its outdated posters and trophies from high school track, I stared at the ceiling and listened to the sounds of suburbia sprinklers, distant television, the hum of central air conditioning. These were supposed to be the sounds of freedom, the American dream I'd spent 8 years defending. Instead, they felt like the soundtrack to my displacement. The discharge papers remained folded in my jacket pocket, unread by anyone who mattered. They detailed leadership roles, combat deployments, lives saved, missions completed. But in this house, surrounded by people who shared my DNA, but not my experience, those papers felt like artifacts from someone else's life. I had come home expecting to find my place in the family I'd left behind. Instead, I discovered that my absence had been so complete, so easily absorbed, that my return felt like an intrusion rather than a homecoming. 3 years ago, I stepped off the plane at LAX carrying nothing but a duffel bag and 8 years of memories I couldn't share. The fluorescent lights felt harsh after months in desert sun, and every sound seemed amplified, the rolling of suitcases, the chatter of reuniting families, the mechanical voice announcing departures to places I'd only dreamed of visiting as a tourist. My father stood near the baggage claim, checking his watch. He wore his courtroom posture, shoulders back, expression neutral, like he was waiting for a client rather than his son. When our eyes met, he managed a thin smile and a handshake that felt more professional than paternal. "Good flight?" he asked, already scanning for the exit. "Long," I replied, though I'd slept most of the way. What I meant was that the journey home had taken 8 years. It's not 8 hours. The drive to their house in Pasadena was filled with safe conversation, whether his latest case involving a contentious divorce, nothing about where I'd been or what I'd done, nothing about the papers folded in my jacket pocket, the ones that documented my honorable discharge and the commendations I'd earned in places whose names he couldn't pronounce. At home, my mother had prepared my favorite meal pot roast with mashed potatoes, but the portions felt childish, as if I were still the 18-year-old who'd left for basic training. Sarah arrived late, breezing in with apologies about a client meeting, her designer heels clicking against the hardwood floors I'd helped install during high school summers. "So, you're back," she said, settling into her chair with practiced efficiency. "What's the plan now?" The question hung in the air like smoke. I had saved money, had skills, had experienced leading men in situations that would break most people. But sitting at that dining room table, surrounded by law degrees and marketing awards and the comfortable certainty of their civilian lives, I felt like a stranger who'd wandered into the wrong house. "I'm figuring it out," I said, cutting in two. Meat that tasted like childhood but couldn't fill the hollow space that had opened in my chest. My mother changed the subject to neighborhood gossip who had gotten married, divorced, promoted. Their world had continued spinning without me, each revelation highlighting how completely I'd been erased from their daily thoughts. When Mrs. Patterson from next door stopped by with a welcome home cake, my father introduced me as Robert's son, just back from overseas, as if my name and my service were afterthoughts. That night, lying in my childhood bedroom with its outdated posters and trophies from high school track, I stared at the ceiling and listened to the sounds of suburbia sprinklers, distant television, the hum of central air conditioning. These were supposed to be the sounds of freedom, the American dream I'd spent 8 years defending. Instead, they felt like the soundtrack to my displacement. The discharge papers remained folded in my jacket pocket, unread by anyone who mattered. They detailed leadership roles, combat deployments, lives saved, missions completed. But in this house, surrounded by people who shared my DNA, but not my experience, those papers felt like artifacts from someone else's life. I had come home expecting to find my place in the family I'd left behind. Instead, I discovered that my absence had been so complete, so easily absorbed, that my return felt like an intrusion rather than a homecoming. The phrase became their shield against uncomfortable conversations, their way of minimizing 8 years of my life into something digestible for cocktail party small talk. "Oh, Marcus," was just following orders. The first time I heard my father use it was at the country club, 3 months after I'd returned home. I was washing dishes in their kitchen, still adjusting to the rhythm of civilian life, when I heard voices from the patio. Through the window, I watched him gesture with his golf club while talking to Jim Morrison, the club president. "Your boy didn't go the college route, did he?" Morrison asked, settling into a Rotary chair. My father's shoulders tensed almost imperceptibly. "Marcus served overseas. Military service, you know. It's just following orders, doing his duty." The way he said it, casual, dismissive, like explaining away a career detour rather than acknowledging sacrifice, made my hands still in the soapy water. Just following orders, as if 8 years of decisions, training, leadership, sleepless nights in hostile territory could be reduced to mindless obedience. Morrison nodded with the polite disinterest, reserved for other people's disappointments. "Well, that's noble, I suppose. What's he planning to do now? Real career, I mean?" I didn't wait to hear my father's response. I dried my hands and walked away, my old combat boots silent on the hardwood floors, the same boots that had carried me through 3 deployments, the only possessions from my service that I still wore regularly. The leather was scuffed and faded, but they fit my feet like a second skin, grounding me when everything else felt uncertain. The phrase followed me everywhere. When my mother's book club friends asked about my gap years, she would smile and explain that I had done my service just following orders, you understand. When Sarah's colleagues inquired about her family at office parties, she would mention her brother, who was in the military, just following orders, nothing too dramatic. Each repetition felt like a small erasure, as if my years of experience were being systematically deleted from the family narrative. They never asked about the men I'd led, the decisions I'd made under pressure, the times I'd chosen courage over safety. To them, military service was something that happened to people who lacked better options, not something someone chose because it mattered. The worst instance came during Thanksgiving dinner 6 months after my return. Uncle David, my father's brother, had brought his new girlfriend, a psychology professor who peppered me with questions about reintegration challenges and post-service adjustment difficulties. She meant well, but her clinical approach made me feel like a case study, rather than a person. It must be difficult, she said, cutting her turkey with academic precision. Transitioning from a structured environment where you were just following orders to making independent decisions in civilian life. The table went quiet. Sarah stared. At her plate, my mother reached for her wine glass. My father cleared his throat with the practiced authority of someone accustomed to controlling conversations. Marcus adapted quickly, he said, his lawyer's voice smooth and final. Military service teaches discipline, following orders, that sort of thing. Good foundation for civilian work. I set down my fork, the sound louder than it should have been in the sudden silence. Is that what you think I did over there? Just followed orders? My father's eyes met mine across the table, and I saw something I recognized from courtrooms. The look of someone who knew they were losing an argument but couldn't afford to concede. Well, yes, he said carefully. That's how the military works, isn't it? Chain of command? Following orders from superiors? I thought about explaining the difference between following orders and making life or death decisions in situations no manual could prepare you for. I considered telling them about the night I disobeyed direct orders to save a wounded Afghan interpreter, or the times I'd had to choose between conflicting directives from officers who weren't on the ground, weren't seeing what I was seeing. Instead, I excused myself from the table and walked outside, letting the cool November air fill my lungs. Through the dining room window, I watched my family continue their meal, the conversation flowing around the empty space I'd left as if I'd never been there at all. That night, I understood something that would shape the next 3 years of my relationship with them. They needed to believe I had just been following orders. The alternative, acknowledging that I had chosen to serve, had made independent decisions. It found meaning and purpose in something they couldn't understand was too threatening to their carefully constructed worldview. So I let them have their phrase, their comfortable explanation. I wore my combat boots and kept my experiences to myself, becoming the invisible veteran in their midst. The son and brother who had served his country but somehow, in their eyes, had never quite served his family's vision of success. The letters from the Department of Veterans Affairs arrived with mechanical regularity, crisp, white envelopes bearing official seals and return addresses that might as well have been written in a foreign language. To my family, they accumulated on the kitchen counter like unmarked tombstones, unopened and unmentioned, testament to a part of my life that existed in parallel to the suburban reality we all pretended was complete. I would find them there during my morning coffee ritual, stacked beneath grocery store circulars and credit card offers, as if the VA correspondence was just another form of junk mail. Sometimes my mother would hand them to me with the same distracted courtesy she showed door-to-door salesmen. It's a polite acknowledgement of something she didn't want to engage with. More military mail, she would say, not unkindly, but with the tone. Reserved for bills and bureaucratic nuisances. The envelopes contained information about benefits I wasn't sure I deserved, counseling services I wasn't sure I needed, and support groups for veterans struggling with transitions I wasn't sure I was struggling with, at least not in ways my family would recognize or understand. The nightmares came sporadically, not every night, but often enough to make sleep feel like a gamble. I would wake with my heart hammering against my ribs, sheets soaked with sweat, the phantom sound of incoming mortars echoing in my ears. The first few times, my mother knocked on my bedroom door, concerned about the noise. "Bad dream?" she would ask through the thin wood, her voice careful and distant. "Yeah, I'm fine," I would respond, and that would be the end of it. We developed an unspoken agreement. I would minimize the disturbances, and she would pretend they weren't happening. During family dinners, conversation flowed around me like water around a stone. They discussed Sarah's latest promotion, my father's courtroom victories, my mother's book club selections, the neighbor's divorce proceedings. I became an expert at nodding at appropriate intervals, making non-committal sounds that suggested engagement without requiring actual participation. When they asked about my day, I learned to edit ruthlessly. I couldn't mention the moments when crowded spaces made my skin crawl, or how the sound of construction equipment sometimes sent me back to places I'd rather forget. I couldn't explain why I preferred driving routes that avoided certain intersections, why I automatically cataloged exit strategies in restaurants, or why sudden loud noises made me calculate cover and concealment options before my rationale. Mind caught up. Instead, I talked about job applications and interview prospects, the safe subjects that allowed them to maintain their narrative about my eventual integration into their version of normal life. I was applying to security firms, logistics companies, anything that might value military experience without requiring explanation of what that experience actually entailed. The job interviews themselves became exercises in translation. Potential. Employers would scan my resume, note the military service, and ask questions that revealed their own assumptions about what I'd done overseas. So you managed personnel in a structured environment, one hiring manager said, reading from notes he'd taken during our conversation. Following established protocols, implementing directives from superiors. I nodded, not bothering to correct his understanding. How could I explain that managing personnel meant keeping 19-year-olds alive in situations where established protocols were suggestions at best? How could I describe the weight of making decisions when following directives from superiors might get your people killed? The disconnection between my experience and their interpretation of it felt like living in parallel universes. In their world, military service was something that happened to other people's children, admirable in theory, but somehow lesser than civilian achievement. In my world, military service had been the most meaningful, challenging, transformative experience of my life. Evenings became my refuge. After my family retreated to their respective activities, my father to his home office, my mother to her television programs, Sarah to her social obligations, I would sit in the backyard and listen to the sounds of suburbia settling into night. The silence felt both comforting and isolating, a space where I could exist without performance or explanation. Sometimes I would call other veterans I'd served with, guys who understood the particular loneliness of coming home to people who loved you but couldn't reach you. These conversations became lifelines, reminders that my experiences were real and valid, even if my family couldn't acknowledge them. "How's the civilian thing going?" Torres would ask, from his apartment in Denver, his voice carrying the same careful neutrality I heard in my own when discussing family. "It's an adjustment," I would reply, and he would understand exactly what that meant. The unopened VA letters multiplied, creating their own small monument to services offered but not accessed, support systems available but not utilized. It represented possibilities I wasn't ready to explore, acknowledgement of needs I wasn't prepared to admit. In my family's house, where mental health was discussed in whispers and therapy was for other people with more dramatic problems, seeking help felt like confirmation of weakness rather than wisdom. So I carried my readjustment privately, wore my invisible wounds like old clothes, familiar, uncomfortable, but serviceable enough to get through each day. I became an expert at functional depression, skilled at maintaining appearances while feeling fundamentally disconnected from the life I was supposed to want. The combat boots I wore became my secret rebellion, the only visible reminder of who I'd been before I became the family disappointment who was just following orders. They grounded me to a version of myself that had mattered, that had made a difference, that had earned respect through action rather than explanation. In quiet moments, I would look at those unopened letters and wonder what might change if I finally opened them, if I admitted that coming home had been harder than any deployment. But admission felt like betrayal of my family's need for normalcy, of their investment in my successful reintegration, of their comfortable belief that love and good intentions were sufficient to heal wounds they couldn't see. The invitation arrived on a Tuesday morning in March, delivered with the precision of military timing I'd almost forgotten existed in civilian life. The envelope was thick, formal, embossed with the city's seal, and addressed to Sergeant Marcus Chen. An elegant calligraphy that transformed my name into something worthy of respect. I found it on the kitchen counter between a grocery store flyer and my mother's magazine subscription renewal notice. Its cream-colored paper, standing out like a flag of surrender among the mundane correspondence of suburban life. My hands shook slightly as I opened it, not from nervousness, but from the unfamiliar sensation of being formally recognized by my military rank after 3 years of being just Marcus or Robert's son, or that boy who was in the Army. The invitation was beautiful in its simplicity. The city of Pasadena cordially invites you to the dedication ceremony of the Pasadena Veterans Memorial, honoring our local heroes who made the ultimate sacrifice in service to their country. The date was set for the first Saturday in April, with a reception to follow. At the bottom, in smaller print, was a line that made my chest tighten. Special recognition for families of the honored fallen and surviving members of their units. I read it 3 times, trying to understand why I'd been specifically invited. To an event honoring fallen soldiers? My unit had lost people, good people. Friends whose names I still couldn't say out loud without feeling the familiar ache of survivor's guilt. But this was a local memorial, and most of the guys I'd served with were from different states. Different lives, different stories than mine. My mother discovered the invitation that evening while I was helping her clear dinner dishes. She picked it up from where I'd left it on the counter, her reading glasses sliding down her nose as she studied the formal language. "Oh, this is lovely," she said, her voice carrying the bright enthusiasm she reserved for community events and social obligations. "The city is finally putting up a proper war memorial. Your father will be pleased. He's been saying they needed something like this for years." She read further, her expression shifting as she processed the details. "It says here you've been specifically invited. That's nice, dear. Recognition for local veterans." I dried the last plate, choosing my words carefully. "I'm not sure why they invited me specifically. Seems to be focused on families of fallen soldiers." "Well, you served with people who died, didn't you?" she asked, folding the invitation neatly. "Maybe they want veterans there to represent their fallen friends. That would be meaningful." Interpretation was logical, comforting even. I had lost friends in combat, brothers whose memories deserved honor and recognition. Being there to represent them felt both appropriate and necessary. Still, something about the formal invitation, the specific language about families of the honored fallen, nagged at me like a splinter I couldn't locate. When my father arrived home from his office, my mother showed him the invitation with the pride she usually reserved for Sarah's professional achievements. He examined it with the methodical attention he brought to legal documents, noting the city seal, the formal language, the quality of the paper. "Very dignified," he pronounced, setting it on the kitchen island where family announcements were. "Displayed the city did this right. It's important to honor those who served." There was something different in his voice when he said it, a note of respect that had been absent from previous discussions of my military service. The formal invitation seemed to legitimize my experience in a way that my own words never had. Sarah discovered it when she stopped by for Sunday dinner the following week. She photographed it with her phone, her marketing instincts immediately recognizing the event's potential for social media content. "This is perfect," she said, already composing captions in her head. "A family supporting our veterans, honoring local heroes." Very on brand for civic engagement. Her enthusiasm was genuine, even if filtered through the lens of personal branding that shaped most of her social interactions. She began planning her outfit, discussing the importance of looking respectful, but not somber, engaged, but not performative. "We should all go," she announced, as if attending together was obviously the right choice. "It's important for the family to show support." I watched this transformation with a mixture of gratitude and skepticism. For 3 years, my military service had been something they politely ignored or actively minimized. Now, suddenly, a formal invitation had made it worthy of family participation, something they could attend with pride rather than embarrassment. Part of me wanted to question their sudden interest, to point out the irony of their enthusiasm for a memorial event after years of treating my service as slightly shameful. But a larger part of me was simply grateful for their attention. Their willingness to step into my world, even if it took an engraved invitation to get them there. The invitation remained on the kitchen island for the rest of the month, daily. Reminder of the approaching ceremony. Sometimes I would find family members glancing at it, as if trying to decode some hidden meaning in the formal language. Their curiosity was palpable, mixed with a nervousness I couldn't quite understand. "Do you think there will be media there?" my mother asked one evening. "Should we prepare remarks if someone asks us about Marcus's service?" Question revealed how little they knew about what they were walking into, how completely they'd avoided engaging with the reality of military service and sacrifice. They were approaching the memorial ceremony like a social event, something to be navigated with the same careful preparation they brought to country club functions and professional networking. I didn't have the heart to tell them that memorial services for fallen soldiers weren't occasions for prepared remarks or photo opportunities. They were sacred spaces where grief and gratitude intersected, where the weight of sacrifice made small talk impossible, and social protocols irrelevant. As the ceremony date approached, I found myself torn between anticipation and anxiety. Wanted my family there. Wanted them to see military service honored and respected in a way they'd never managed to express. But I also feared their reaction to the reality of military loss, to the stories and faces that would make abstract concepts concrete and personal. The invitation had opened a door between my two worlds, and I wasn't sure either side was prepared for what they might find on the other side. The morning of the ceremony, I stood in front of my bedroom mirror holding my dress blue uniform, its dark fabric still perfectly pressed, despite 3 years in the closet. The uniform had been tailored to fit the man I was at 26, newly promoted and confident in my military identity. Now, at 34, it felt like wearing someone else's skin. The ribbons and badges told a story my family had never bothered to read. Combat deployments, leadership positions, commendations for valor and service. Each colored strip represented months of my life. Decisions made under pressure, responsibilities that had shaped me in ways civilian life couldn't touch. But as I fastened the buttons and adjusted the belt, I wondered if wearing the uniform would finally make them see me differently, or if it would just provide more convenient shorthand for their dismissive narratives. Downstairs, my family was engaged in their own careful preparations. My mother had chosen a navy dress that struck the appropriate balance between respectful and fashionable, while my father wore his best suit, the one reserved for court appearances and important client meetings. Sarah had opted for elegant simplicity, her outfit calculated to photograph well if social media opportunities arose. "You look very handsome," my mother said when I appeared in the kitchen, but her voice carried an uncertainty that suggested she wasn't sure how to react to seeing me in uniform. For 3 years, I'd been her civilian son, safely reintegrated into normal life. The uniform transformed me back into someone she'd never quite learned to recognize. My father's reaction was more complex. He studied me with the same analytical attention he brought to cross-examining witnesses, taking in details he'd never noticed or cared about before. The ribbons, the badges, the precise arrangement of military decorations that meant nothing to him but somehow commanded respect through their very existence. "Those are quite impressive," he said, gesturing toward the rows of ribbons on my chest. "What do they represent?" It was the first time in 3 years he'd asked about my military service with genuine interest rather than polite obligation. I explained briefly: deployment ribbons, combat action badge, leadership positions, watching his expression shift as he processed information he'd never bothered to request before. "You never mentioned most of these," he said, his lawyer's instincts detecting inconsistencies in testimony he'd never properly heard. "You never asked," I replied, not unkindly. The truth sat between us like evidence neither of us wanted to examine too closely. The drive to the memorial site was unusually quiet, each of us lost in our own thoughts about what we were walking into. I stared out the window at familiar Pasadena streets, wondering how many of my neighbors knew about the ceremony. How many of them had family members whose service had been similarly overlooked or undervalued. When we arrived at Memorial Park, I was surprised by the scale of the gathering. Hundreds of people filled the landscaped area around the new memorial, their faces reflecting the gravity of the occasion. Veterans in uniform stood alongside civilians in their Sunday best. Gold Star families clutched folded flags, and local officials prepared to deliver remarks about sacrifice and service. My family stayed close together, their suburban confidence faltering in the presence of so much concentrated grief and pride. They weren't used to events where their social skills couldn't navigate the emotional terrain, where small talk felt inappropriate, and their usual conversational strategies didn't apply. "There are so many people," my mother whispered, as if the crowd size somehow magnified the significance of what we were witnessing. I guided them toward the section designated for invited guests, feeling the weight of curious glances from other attendees. Several veterans nodded in recognition, not of me specifically, but of shared experience reflected in my uniform and bearing. A few older men, Korean War and Vietnam veterans, offered brief salutes that I returned with automatic precision. Sarah fumbled with her phone, clearly wanting to document the occasion, but uncertain about the appropriateness of taking photos at a memorial service. Her social media instincts were at war with her growing awareness that this wasn't the kind of event that translated well to curated online content. An elderly woman approached us, her eyes bright with unshed tears and the particular intensity that marked Gold Star mothers. She wore a small pin with a photograph of a young soldier, her son's face, forever frozen at 19. "Thank you for your service," she said to me, her voice steady, despite the emotion behind it. "It means everything to have veterans here today, representing those who can't speak for themselves." I accepted her gratitude with the humility military service had taught me, but her words created an uncomfortable awareness in my family. They were witnessing the reality of military sacrifice, the cost that other families had paid, the community of loss and service they'd never understood existed. As we took our seats, I noticed my father watching the interactions around us with the focused attention he brought to understanding new environments. He was processing the social dynamics, the hierarchies of grief and service, the unspoken protocols that governed behavior in this sacred space. "I didn't realize," he said quietly, leaning toward me as the ceremony began to organize itself, "the scope of it all." What he meant, I understood, was that he'd never considered military service as anything more than a personal choice with personal consequences. He was beginning to glimpse the larger community of service and sacrifice, the network of families, and veterans who understood costs he'd never calculated. The ceremony was about to begin, and I could feel my family's anxiety mixing with their growing awareness that they were about to witness something that would challenge their assumptions about my service and its meaning. They had come expecting a polite civic event, suitable for social media and dinner party conversation. Instead, we're about to confront the reality of military loss, and the uncomfortable truth that their own son's service was part of a larger story they'd never bothered to understand. The memorial stood before us, like a granite monument to conversations my family had never been willing to have, covered by a massive American flag that stirred gently in the morning breeze. The structure commanded respect through its simple dignity-polished black stone rising from a foundation of red brick, surrounded by perfectly maintained landscaping. That spoke to the community's investment in honoring its heroes. Mayor Patricia Hernandez stepped to the podium, her voice carrying across the assembled crowd with the practiced authority of someone accustomed to speaking at significant occasions. She wore a dark suit that managed to be both professional and respectful, her silver hair pulled back in a style that conveyed gravity without severity. "We gather today," she began, "not just to dedicate a memorial, but to acknowledge a debt that can never be fully repaid. The names we will unveil represent more than statistics of service. They represent sons, daughters, fathers, mothers, friends, and neighbors who answered their country's call and paid the ultimate price." I watched my family absorb these opening words, their faces reflecting the growing realization that they were witnessing something more profound than a civic ceremony. Sarah had put away her phone, her usual impulse to document and share overwhelmed by the solemnity of the occasion. My mother reached for my father's hand, a gesture that acknowledged their shared uncertainty about how to navigate this emotional landscape. The mayor continued, outlining the memorial's significance and the community effort that had brought it to reality. She spoke about local families who had contributed, veterans organizations that had provided guidance, and the careful research that had gone into ensuring every fallen hero was properly represented. "Each name on this memorial tells a story," she said, her voice gaining strength as she approached the core of her message. "Stories of courage, sacrifice, and love of country that transcends individual ambition. These were ordinary people who chose to do extraordinary things when their nation needed them most." Colonel James Martinez, representing the local veterans organizations, stepped forward to address the military significance of the memorial. He was a man in his 60s, his posture still reflecting decades of military bearing despite civilian clothes that couldn't quite disguise his warrior background. "Veterans in attendance today understand the weight of what we're dedicating," he said, his eyes scanning the crowd and pausing briefly on uniformed service members scattered throughout the gathering. "We understand that freedom isn't free, that democracy requires defenders, and that some prices can only be paid in blood." His words carried the particular authority that comes from personal experience with loss and survival. Several veterans in the crowd nodded recognition, their faces reflecting memories of friends who hadn't made it home, battles that had cost more than victory could ever justify. "The families of our fallen heroes carry a burden that most of us can never fully comprehend," Colonel Martinez continued. "They live with the knowledge that their loved ones chose service over safety, duty over comfort, country over self. Today, we share that burden. We promise that these sacrifices will not be forgotten, that these names will endure, that these stories will continue to inspire future generations. I felt my own chest tighten as he spoke, remembering faces from my deployments. Voices I would never hear again. Laughter silenced by decisions made in split seconds under impossible circumstances. Military service creates bonds forged in shared danger and mutual dependence. Losing those connections leaves wounds that never fully heal. My father leaned toward me, his voice barely above a whisper. "How many people did you serve with who? ... He couldn't finish the question, but I understood what he was asking. "Too many," I replied, my voice equally quiet. For the first time, I saw him processing the reality that my military service hadn't been abstract duty performed in safe environments, but actual risks shared with real people who hadn't all survived the experience. The ceremony continued with readings from local religious leaders representing the diverse faith communities that had supported the memorial project. Rabbi Sarah Goldman spoke about remembrance and legacy. Father Miguel Santos offered prayers for peace and comfort, and Imam Abdullah Hassan reminded the gathering that service and sacrifice transcended cultural boundaries. Their words wove together themes of gratitude, loss, and hope that resonated beyond any single religious tradition. The interfaith nature of the ceremony reflected Pasadena's diversity while acknowledging that grief and pride were universal human experiences that connected all families touched by military service. As the formal remarks concluded, I noticed volunteers beginning to position themselves around the covered memorial. These were family members of the fallen veterans who had served with the honored dead, and community leaders who would participate in the unveiling ceremony. Their movements were deliberate, practiced, suggesting rehearsals that had prepared them for this moment. The crowd quieted as Mayor Hernandez returned to the podium for the final portion of the ceremony. Her expression had shifted from official courtesy to personal emotion, reflecting the weight of what they were about to reveal. Names you will see today represent 19 local heroes who made the ultimate sacrifice in service to our nation. They served in conflicts from Vietnam to Afghanistan, spanning generations of Americans who answered their country's call. Their stories are our stories. Their sacrifice is our inheritance. Their memory is our responsibility. My family sat in complete stillness, their earlier nervousness replaced by growing awareness that they were about to witness something that would change their understanding of military service and its costs. The numbers were specific, personal. Local 19 families in their own community who had experienced losses they couldn't imagine. As the volunteers prepared to unveil the memorial, I found myself holding my breath, wondering whose names I might recognize, whose faces would flash through my memory, whose stories might intersect with my own experiences in ways I hadn't anticipated. The flag began to move, lifted carefully by honor guard members whose precise movements reflected years of practice in handling the symbol of the nation these heroes had died defending. The crowd stood as one, hands over hearts, faces upturned toward the memorial that was about to transform from covered monument to sacred record of ultimate sacrifice. In that moment before revelation, I understood that my family was about to confront the reality of military loss in ways that would make their previous dismissal of my service impossible to maintain. They were about to see names, read stories, and understand costs they had never bothered to calculate. The flag fell away like a curtain dropping on a stage, revealing the polished black granite surface that would forever preserve the names of Pasadena's fallen heroes. The memorial was elegant in its simplicity, 19 names, etched in gold lettering, arranged chronologically by conflict. Each entry accompanied by rank, unit, and date of death. My eyes scanned the names automatically, a habit from military service where situational awareness could mean the difference between life and death. Vietnam veterans filled the top section, their names testimony to a conflict that had shaped an entire generation. Below them, smaller sections honored those lost in Grenada, Panama, the Gulf War, and the ongoing conflicts in Iraq and Afghanistan. Then I saw it, my own name, etched in gold letters that caught the morning sunlight like a beacon. Staff Sergeant Marcus Chen, 3rd Infantry Division, October 15th, 2019. The world seemed to tilt on its axis. Sound became muffled, as if I were underwater. My vision narrowed to that single line of text that declared me dead, officially and permanently. In polished granite that would outlast us all, my mother's sharp intake of breath cut through the fog of my shock. She was staring at the memorial, her hand pressed to her mouth, her face cycling through confusion, disbelief, and dawning horror. That's she started, then stopped. Unable to finish the sentence, my father stood frozen beside her, his lawyer's mind struggling to process evidence that contradicted everything he thought he knew about reality. His eyes moved from the memorial to me and back again, as if checking and rechecking testimony that couldn't possibly be accurate. "Marcus," Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible above the murmur of the crowd. "Your name is on there. Your name is on the memorial." Other attendees had begun to notice our family's distress. A few people followed our horrified gazes to the memorial, then looked back at me standing among them in my dress uniform, very much alive despite the official declaration of my death carved in stone. Colonel Martinez, who had delivered remarks earlier, approached our small group with concern etched on his weathered face. He had clearly witnessed our shock and was moving to offer assistance or explanation. "Is everything all right?" he asked, his voice carrying the gentle authority of someone accustomed to dealing with family trauma at military ceremonies. My father, still staring at the memorial, managed to point toward my name. "There's been a mistake," he said, his voice strained with the effort of maintaining composure. "That's my son's name, but he's here. He's alive." Colonel Martinez followed his gesture, then looked at me with sudden recognition that suggested he knew more about my situation than my family did. His expression shifted from concern to understanding, then to something approaching reverence. "There's no mistake," he said quietly, his words carrying weight that seemed to settle over our family like a heavy blanket. Staff Sergeant Chen died on October 15, 2019, in Kandahar Province, Afghanistan. He died saving the lives of 23 soldiers under his command. The words hit my family like physical blows. My mother actually staggered, forcing my father to steady her with an arm around her waist. Sarah's face had gone completely white, her usual composure shattered by information that made no sense in the context of everything they thought they knew about my life. "But he's here," my mother said, her voice rising with hysteria that she was struggling to contain. "He's standing right here. Came home 3 years ago. He's been living with us." Colonel Martinez's eyes met mine, and I saw in them a question about how much my family knew, how much they were prepared to learn, how much truth they could handle in this public setting surrounded by other grieving families. I understood in that moment of terrible clarity that my family was about to learn the story I had never been able to tell them, the story of how I had died and been reborn, how the man who came home was both their son and someone else entirely, how just following orders had become the most inadequate description possible for what had actually happened in that desert on the other side of the world. The memorial ceremony continued around us, but our small family drama had created its own pocket of suspended time. Other attendees were beginning to notice our distress, their curious glances adding pressure to a situation that was already straining toward some kind of breaking point. Perhaps Colonel Martinez said gently, "This would be better discussed somewhere more private. Family support center is just across the street. We can talk there." But my mother was beyond reason, beyond the social protocols that usually governed her behavior in public settings. 3 years of questions she had never asked, conversations she had never allowed, truths she had never wanted to face were converging in this moment of forced revelation. "I don't understand," she said, her voice carrying across the gathered crowd, despite my father's attempts to quiet her. "How can his name be on a memorial for dead soldiers when he's standing right here? How can he be dead when he's been living in our house?" The question hung in the air like an accusation, challenging not just the accuracy of the memorial but the fundamental assumptions that Spea had shaped our family's understanding of my service and return. Other families nearby had stopped their own conversations to listen, drawn by the raw emotion and obvious distress of people grappling with impossible circumstances. I realized that this moment, this public revelation in front of hundreds of strangers, was going to force conversations that should have happened 3 years ago in the privacy of our home. The memorial had accomplished what no amount of gentle persuasion or family dinners could. It had made my hidden truth visible, undeniable, carved in stone that would outlast all of our careful avoidance and comfortable lies. The name on the memorial was accurate. Staff Sergeant Marcus Chen had died on October 15, 2019. The man who came home was someone else, someone who had been forged in that moment of ultimate sacrifice, someone who carried that death within him like a wound that had never properly healed. Now my family would finally learn the difference between the son they remembered and the man who had returned to them, between the simple narrative of military service they had constructed and the complex reality of transformation through loss that no civilian could truly understand. The Family Support Center felt like a sanctuary compared to the public exposure of the memorial ceremony. Fluorescent lights hummed softly overhead, casting everything in the neutral illumination of institutional spaces designed for difficult conversations. My family sat clustered together on uncomfortable chairs, their faces still, registering shock from revelations that had shattered 3 years of carefully maintained fiction. Colonel Martinez settled across from us, his weathered hands folded. On the simple wooden table that separated truth from comfortable lies, between us sat a manila folder, thick with documents, official records, that would explain what my family had never been allowed to understand. "Before we begin," he said, his voice carrying the gentle authority of someone who had delivered devastating news to families before, "I want you to understand that everything your son told you about coming home 3 years ago was true. He did return. He is alive. The story of how that happened is more complex than most families ever have to confront." My mother leaned forward, her hands clenched in her lap.
Ow!
"Then why is his name on a memorial for dead soldiers?" Colonel Martinez opened the folder and withdrew a photograph on 8x10 color print that made my breath catch in my throat. It showed a silver star medal, its distinctive blue ribbon and silver star catching light against a presentation box lined with white silk. This medal was awarded posthumously to Staff Sergeant Marcus Chen for conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity in action against an enemy of the United States, he said, placing the photograph where my family could see it. The citation reads, "For heroic actions on October 15, 2019.
Ow!
When Staff Sergeant Chen single-handedly held off enemy forces for over 6 hours, allowing the successful evacuation of 23 wounded soldiers under his command." Sarah stared at the photograph as if it might change into something she could understand. "Posthumously means after death," she said slowly. "But Marcus is sitting right here. The military declared him killed in action because, medically speaking, he was," Colonel Martinez explained. "Staff Sergeant Chen sustained injuries so severe that field medics pronounced him dead. His heart stopped. His breathing stopped. For all practical purposes, Marcus Chen died on that mountain in Afghanistan." My father's lawyer instincts kicked in, seizing on procedural details that might make sense of information that defied logic. "But obviously he survived. People are declared dead and resuscitated all the time. Why wasn't the record corrected?" "Colonel." Martinez looked at me, seeking permission to continue with details I had never shared. Truths I had protected my family from understanding. I nodded, recognizing that this moment of forced revelation was beyond my control now. "Marcus was clinically dead for 18 minutes, he said quietly. "He sustained multiple gunshot wounds, severe blood loss, and traumatic brain injury from mortar fragments. When the medevac team finally reached him, he was covered by the bodies of 3 enemy combatants he had killed while defending his wounded soldiers." The room fell silent except for the hum of fluorescent lights and my mother's sharp intake of breath. These were details from a world they couldn't imagine, a reality that existed beyond their comfortable suburban understanding of conflict and sacrifice. Evacuation took place under heavy fire. Colonel Martinez continued. "Marcus was transported to a field hospital, then to Germany, then to Walter Reed. For the first month, he was in a medically induced coma. The doctors weren't sure he would survive, and if he did, they weren't sure what kind of recovery was possible." He withdrew another document from the folder, medical report, thick with technical language and dire prognoses. "The man who woke up from that coma was physically Marcus Chen, but he had no memory of the attack, limited recollection of his military service, and significant cognitive impairment from his brain injury." My family absorbed this information like people learning a foreign language, struggling to translate medical terminology into human consequences they could comprehend. They were beginning to understand that the son and brother who had come home was not simply the same person who had left unchanged by his experiences. "The rehabilitation process took nearly 2 years, Colonel Martinez explained. Physical therapy, cognitive therapy, psychological counseling. Marcus had to relearn basic functions, rebuild his memory, reconstruct his identity from fragments of who he used to be." My mother asked, her voice breaking with the pain of 3 years' worth of missed opportunities. "To understand and support? Why didn't anyone contact us?" Why didn't Marcus tell us what had happened? Colonel Martinez's expression softened, with the particular compassion reserved for families grappling with military realities they had never prepared to face. Initially, because the military genuinely believed he would die. Later, because Marcus specifically requested that his family not be notified of his condition or location. The accusation in that statement hit my family like a physical blow. They turned to look at me, their faces reflecting hurt and confusion that I had chosen to protect them from truth, rather than trusting them with reality. I didn't want you to see me like that, I said, speaking for the first time since the memorial revelation. I didn't want you to have to visit military hospitals to watch me relearn how to walk and talk and remember my own name. You two feel obligated to care for someone you might not even recognize as your son. You're our family, my father said, his voice thick with emotion I had rarely heard from him. That's not an obligation, that's love. The weight of his words settled over me like a blanket I had never allowed myself to accept. For 3 years, I had carried the burden of my transformation alone, believing that protecting them from my reality was a form of love. Now I understood that I had also protected myself from risking their rejection, their potential inability to love the person I had become. Colonel Martinez placed another photograph on the table, this one showing me in a hospital bed, connected to machines, my head bandaged, and my face swollen beyond recognition. It was difficult to see any resemblance to the man sitting in the family support center, speaking coherently and moving without assistance. This is why Marcus's name appears on the memorial, he said. The man who died on that mountain in Afghanistan earned that recognition through sacrifice that went far beyond following orders. He made a conscious choice to stay behind, to hold his position, to sacrifice his life so that 23 other soldiers could go home to their families. The truth was finally complete, laid out in official documents and medical reports that transformed my family's understanding of everything they thought they knew about my service. I hadn't just followed orders, I had transcended them, choosing heroism over survival in a moment that had cost me everything and saved everyone who mattered. Colonel Martinez reached deeper into the folder and withdrew a document heavily marked with black redaction lines, classified material that had been partially declassified for this specific conversation. The paper looked like a crossword puzzle of secrets, with crucial details obscured, but enough information visible to tell a story my family had never imagined. Operation Steadfast Guardian, he read from the document header. October 14th to 15th, 2019. Forward Operating Base Chapman, Kandahar Province, Afghanistan. The official language felt strange applied to memories that existed in my mind as fragments flashes of sound, sensation, and desperate decision-making that no military report could fully capture. Listening to Colonel Martinez read the sanitized version, it helped me piece together a narrative I had never been able to construct for myself. Staff Sergeant Chen was leading a reconnaissance patrol consisting of 24 soldiers, he continued. Their mission was to establish observation posts along suspected insurgent supply routes in the mountains east of the base. I closed my eyes and could almost smell the thin mountain air, feel the weight of equipment that seemed impossibly heavy at altitude, hear the nervous jokes soldiers made when they knew they were walking into dangerous territory. These men had trusted me to bring them home safely, kids from small towns across America who had enlisted for reasons as varied as college money, family tradition, and simple patriotism. At approximately 0430 hours on October 15th, the patrol came under coordinated attack from insurgent forces, estimated at 40 to 50 combatants. Colonel Martinez read, "The enemy had prepared an ambush using the high ground advantage in superior numbers." The clinical language couldn't convey the chaos of that moment, the sudden eruption of gunfire from multiple directions, the immediate understanding that we had walked into a carefully planned trap. The split-second realization that escape routes had been cut off and our only options were fight or die. During the initial contact, 17 members of the patrol sustained wounds ranging from minor to life-threatening. The report continued. Staff Sergeant Chen organized the wounded into a defensive position and called for immediate medical evacuation. What the report didn't capture was the sound of 19-year-old Martinez crying for his mother as blood soaked through his uniform, or the way Corporal Williams kept trying to return to the fight despite a shattered leg that made standing impossible. These weren't statistics. They were kids who had trusted me to make decisions that would save their lives. The landing zone for medical evacuation was under direct enemy fire, Colonel Martinez read. Multiple attempts by helicopters to reach the wounded resulted in aircraft taking significant damage and being forced to abort their missions. My father leaned forward, his legal mind focusing on tactical details that might help him understand the impossible situation. So the helicopters couldn't land because of enemy fire? Correct, Colonel Martinez confirmed. The insurgents had positioned themselves to control the high ground around the only suitable landing zone. Any aircraft attempting to land would be destroyed, along with its crew and medical personnel. So what happened? Sarah asked, though her voice suggested she was beginning to understand that the answer would be more difficult than she wanted. To hear, Colonel Martinez found his place in the document and continued reading. Staff Sergeant Chen made the decision to establish a one-man defensive position approximately 200 meters from the wounded, drawing enemy fire away from the potential landing zone. The euphemistic language made it sound like a tactical maneuver, rather than a suicide mission. What actually happened was that I grabbed as much ammunition as I could carry and positioned myself where every insurgent in the area could see me, making myself the most attractive target on the battlefield. For the next 6 hours and 17 minutes, Staff Sergeant Chen engaged enemy forces in sustained combat, preventing them from advancing on the wounded soldiers and keeping the landing zone clear for medical evacuation. 6 hours. Seemed impossible even to me, someone who had lived through every minute of it. In combat, time moves differently. Seconds stretch into eternities during firefights, while hours disappear in moments of desperate activity. But 6 hours of continuous combat alone, against overwhelming odds, was beyond what any reasonable person would consider survivable. How did he manage that? My mother asked, her voice barely above a whisper. One person against 50. Superior positioning, excellent marksmanship, and tactical knowledge of insurgent behavior patterns, Colonel Martinez replied, but mostly through sheer determination and refusal to abandon his responsibilities to his soldiers. What he didn't mention was the cold calculation involved in making myself bait. The understanding that drawing enemy fire meant accepting wounds, that holding position meant accepting death, that saving 23 lives required sacrificing one. The medical evacuation was successful at approximately 1100 hours, the colonel continued. All wounded personnel were evacuated to appropriate medical facilities. Staff Sergeant Chen was found unconscious at his position. Having sustained multiple gunshot wounds and significant blood loss, the report couldn't capture the silence that had fallen over the battlefield when the shooting finally stopped, or the way the medevac crew approached my position, expecting to recover a body rather than treat a survivor. By all reasonable medical standards, I should have died hours before they reached me. The enemy combatants killed by Staff Sergeant Chen during this engagement numbered at least 12 confirmed, with additional probable casualties. Colonel Martinez read, his actions directly resulted in the successful evacuation of 23 wounded soldiers, all of whom survived and recovered from their injuries. 23 lives, who built careers and grew old and contributed to their communities because I had chosen to stay behind and hold a position that couldn't be held. My family sat in stunned silence, processing information that transformed their understanding of military service from abstract concept to personal reality. They were beginning to comprehend that just following orders was the most inadequate description possible for decisions made under fire, choices that required moral courage beyond anything their civilian experience could imagine. Why was he declared dead? My father asked, returning to the procedural question that bothered his orderly legal mind. Because when the medical team reached him, he was clinically dead, Colonel Martinez replied. No pulse, no respiration, massive blood loss. The field medics worked on him for 37 minutes before achieving a faint heartbeat. He was declared killed in action, then brought back to life through extraordinary medical intervention. The phrase "brought back to life" seemed to hang in the air like an echo from a different world, a reality where death and resurrection were possible, where the line between heroism and tragedy was measured in heartbeats and medical miracles. 3 years. My family had lived with a version of me that they didn't understand, someone who seemed familiar but fundamentally changed.
Oh.
Someone who carried invisible wounds and unspoken experiences. Now they were learning that their instincts had been correct. The man who came home was not the same person who had left. The son and brother they knew had died on a mountain in Afghanistan, and the man sitting with them now was someone else. Entirely someone forged in that moment of ultimate sacrifice, carrying the weight of 23 lives saved and 1 life lost. the silence and the family support. Center stretched like a held breath, filled with the weight of revelations that had shattered 3 years of careful distance and willful ignorance. My mother stared at the medical bracelet Colonel Martinez had placed on the tabula, simple plastic band from Walter Reed Medical Center that bore my name, blood type, and a series of codes that documented the extent of my injuries and treatment. "You were in the hospital for 2 years," she said finally, her voice hollow with the realization of time lost, opportunities missed, love withheld. 2 years and we didn't know. We didn't visit. We didn't send cards or flowers, or her voice broke, unable to complete the catalog of support they hadn't provided because they hadn't known it was needed. "We thought you were just stationed somewhere else," my father added. His lawyer's precision now turned inward, examining his own failures with the same methodical attention he brought to cross-examination. "We assumed you were fine. Those calls and emails had been carefully orchestrated fiction, written with the help of social workers and therapists who understood that maintaining family connections required protecting loved ones from realities they weren't equipped to handle. Every casual message about training exercises and routine assignments has been crafted to preserve their peace of mind while I learned to walk again, speak without slurring, to remember faces and names that brain trauma had erased." Sarah fumbled with her phone, pulling up text message threads from the past 3 years. "All these conversations," she said, scrolling through casual exchanges about weather and work and family gossip, "you were recovering from dying in. We were texting you about Sarah's promotion in Dad's golf game." The contrast was almost absurd, their mundane civilian concerns juxtaposed against the reality of cognitive rehabilitation, physical therapy, and psychological counseling that had consumed my days while they worried about quarterly earnings. "And social obligations? Why didn't you tell us?" my mother asked again, but this time the question carried less accusation and more desperate need to understand. "Why did you let us think you were fine when you were going through something so terrible?" I looked at the medical bracelet, that simple piece of plastic that represented months of learning to be human again. "So I didn't want you to feel guilty," I said. "I didn't want you to change your lives, to sacrifice your careers and comfort, to visit military hospitals and watch me struggle with basic functions. I didn't want you to love me out of pity or obligation. Oh, instead you let us ignore you out of ignorance," my father said, his voice thick with an emotion I had rarely heard from him. "You let us dismiss your service, minimize your sacrifice, treat you like an embarrassment." The accusation hung between us like evidence of a crime they were only now understanding they had committed. For 3 years, they had treated my military service as a disappointing career choice, my homecoming as an inconvenient adjustment, my struggles as personal failings rather than consequences of sacrifice they couldn't comprehend. "We failed you," my mother said, tears finally spilling over. "We failed you so completely that I don't know how to begin making it right." Colonel Martinez cleared his throat gently, reminding us of his presence and his role in facilitating this difficult conversation. "Family reconciliation after traumatic military service is more common than you might think," he said. "Many veterans struggle with how much to share, how much to burden their loved ones with realities that civilian life doesn't prepare people to understand. But the things we said," Sarah whispered, her marketing executive composure completely abandoned. "The way we talked about his service, just following orders, like it didn't matter, like it wasn't real sacrifice." The phrase that had haunted me for 3 years now echoed in the room with the weight of true understanding behind it. They were beginning to grasp that following orders was the minimum requirement of military service, while what I had done transcended duty and entered the realm of conscious heroism. "At the country club," my father said, his voice barely audible, "when Jim Morrison asked about Marcus, I was embarrassed. I was actually embarrassed to have a son who had served his country with distinction, who had saved lives, who had earned medals for valor." The confession hit me like a physical blow, not because it was news, but because hearing it spoken aloud made the pain concrete and undeniable. His embarrassment had been palpable during every social interaction, every introduction, every conversation. Where my military service came up as an inconvenient footnote to more impressive civilian achievements, we judged military service through the lens of our own values, my mother admitted. College career advancement, financial success. Couldn't see past our own prejudices to understand that there are other forms of achievement, other ways to measure a life's worth. The medical bracelet seemed to glow under the fluorescent lights, a tangible reminder of the price I had paid for achievements they had never bothered to recognize or understand. 23 lives saved, enemies defeated. Mission accomplished through sacrifice that went far beyond any civilian metric of success. The night you came home, Sarah said, her voice strengthening as she worked through her own catalog of missed opportunities. You tried to tell us about your experiences. I could see you wanted to share something important, but we changed the subject every time. Didn't want to hear about war or conflict or anything that made us uncomfortable. We wanted you to be the same person who had left, my father acknowledged. We wanted to believe that military service was something that happened to you rather than something that changed you, that you could just pick up where you left off and pretend those 8 years hadn't fundamentally altered who you were. But I wasn't the same person. And the evidence was sitting on the table between us: medals earned through sacrifice, medical records documenting transformation through trauma, official documents that proved the man who came home was both more and less than the boy who had left. The reckoning was painful but necessary. Settling of accounts that should have happened 3 years ago when I first walked through their front door carrying invisible wounds and unspoken experiences. They were finally understanding that they're comfortable. Distance hadn't protected anyone, it had only delayed the inevitable. Confrontation with realities that love should have been strong enough to embrace from the beginning. I don't know how. To fix this, my mother said, her voice small and lost, I don't know how to make up for 3 years of not seeing you, not understanding, not appreciating what you sacrificed. You start by seeing me now, I replied, my voice steadier than I felt. You start by understanding that the man sitting here isn't broken or damaged, but transformed. You start by accepting that military service was the most meaningful thing I've ever done, even though it cost me everything. The medical bracelet sat between us like a bridge across 3 years of missed connections. A simple piece of plastic that represented the beginning of honest conversation about sacrifice, service, and the true meaning of heroism that goes far beyond just following orders. Colonel Martinez reached into the folder one final time and withdrew a purple heart-shaped medal in a presentation case. Its rich purple ribbon, a stark contrast against white satin. The Purple Heart, awarded to those wounded or killed in service to their country, represented not just injury, but sacrifice. Not just survival, but transformation through suffering. This was awarded for the wounds Staff Sergeant Chen sustained. On October 15, 2019, he said, placing the case on the table where my family could see it clearly. But physical wounds are only part of the story. I rolled up my left sleeve, revealing the network of surgical scars that crisscrossed my forearm like a roadmap of trauma. The doctors had done excellent work. The scars were thin, precise lines. That spoke to skilled surgical intervention rather than crude battlefield medicine. But they were permanent reminders of shrapnel that had torn through muscle and bone, requiring multiple operations to repair. My family stared at the scars with the fascination of people seeing evidence of realities they had never imagined. These weren't abstract concepts from news reports or war movies. They were physical proof that their son and brother had bled for strangers, had absorbed enemy fire meant for other soldiers, had paid a physical price for choices that transcended self-preservation. The visible scars are actually the easiest to treat, I said, rolling my sleeve back down. It's the invisible ones that take longer to heal. I had never spoken to them about the nightmares that still came without warning, the way sudden loud noises could transport me back to that mountain in Afghanistan, the hypervigilance that made crowded spaces feel like potential battlefields. These symptoms had no visible markers, no surgical scars to document their reality. PTSD, Colonel Martinez said, using the clinical term that carried weight and legitimacy that civilian understanding often lacked. Post-traumatic stress disorder, a normal response to abnormal experiences, but one that requires ongoing management and support. Is that why you seemed so distant when you came home? My mother asked, her voice gentle but direct. You didn't want to talk about your experiences? Why you seemed uncomfortable at family gatherings? The question opened a door I had kept locked for 3 years, protecting them from knowledge that might have made them feel helpless or guilty. But the memorial ceremony had shattered those protective barriers, making honesty both possible and necessary. Partly, I admitted, but also because I could see that my experiences made you uncomfortable. When I tried to share memories or talk about my friends who didn't make it home, you changed the subject or found reasons to leave the room. Sarah winced at the accuracy of my observation. We didn't know how to respond, she said.
We didn't
have context for understanding loss like that, sacrifice like that. It felt too big, too serious for our normal conversations. So instead of learning how to have bigger conversations, you decided to have smaller ones, I replied. Without malice, but with the clarity that comes from finally being able to speak. Truth without fear of rejection. The Purple Heart Medal seemed to pulse with significance under the fluorescent lights, its very existence proof that invisible wounds were real, documented, worthy of recognition and respect. Military medicine had evolved to understand that psychological trauma was as legitimate as physical injury, that courage in facing ongoing symptoms was as worthy of honor as bravery under fire. The anxiety attacks, I continued, deciding that full honesty was the only path forward, usually happen in crowds or when I'm feeling trapped. My heart races, my hands shake. I start calculating exit strategies and defensive positions. It's not rational, but it's automatic. My father leaned forward, his professional training kicking in as he tried to understand symptoms that had no legal precedent, no courtroom equivalent. Have you been getting treatment? Professional help? The stack of unopened VA letters suddenly made sense to them, not bureaucratic nuisance mail, but offers of support and treatment they had never encouraged me to pursue. Their assumption that I was fine, that successful reintegration was simply a matter of willpower and time, had prevented them from recognizing signs of ongoing struggle. I said, but it's harder to be honest with therapists when you're not being honest with your family. How do you work through trauma when the people closest to you want to pretend it doesn't exist? The accusation landed softly but firmly, highlighting the ways their avoidance had compounded rather than relieved my psychological burden. Recovery from military trauma requires community support, family understanding, acknowledgement that invisible wounds are real and worthy of attention. We made it worse, my mother said, her voice thick with recognition of consequences they had never intended. By not wanting to deal with uncomfortable realities, we made your recovery harder. You made it lonely, I corrected. Recovery was always going to be hard, but doing it alone, feeling like my experiences were shameful or embarrassing, to my own family that made it unnecessarily isolating. Colonel Martinez nodded with the understanding of someone who had witnessed this dynamic repeatedly. Family support is crucial for veteran mental health, he said. Support requires acknowledgement, understanding, willingness to engage with difficult realities rather than avoiding them. Sleeping problems, I continued, building a complete picture of invisible wounds that had been carefully hidden for 3 years. I don't sleep through the night. Haven't since I came home. Every sound, every creak or car door or garbage truck puts me on alert status. That's why you were always up early, Sarah realized. We thought you were just naturally an early riser, but you were already awake because you hadn't been sleeping. What? Observation was accurate and painful. Example of how their assumptions had prevented them from seeing obvious signs of ongoing struggle. Military hypervigilance doesn't disappear with discharge papers. It requires understanding, patience, and acknowledgement that some changes are permanent rather than temporary. The guilt is probably the worst part, I said, approaching the core of psychological wounds that had no visible markers. Survivor guilt. 23 men went home because I stayed behind, but I survived when I shouldn't have. I carry their faces, their stories, their families' gratitude for something that feels undeserved. This was territory that civilian understanding struggled to navigate the complex psychology of military sacrifice, where heroism and trauma intersected in ways that defied simple narratives about courage and recovery. But you saved them, my father said, his voice carrying the certainty of someone grasping for logical solutions to illogical problems. You should feel proud, not guilty. Logic and emotion don't always align after trauma, Colonel Martinez explained gently. Survivor guilt is common among combat veterans, especially those who made heroic sacrifices. The mind struggles to process surviving situations where others didn't. The Purple Heart Medal represented not just physical wounds healed but ongoing, psychological battles fought daily, victories measured in hours of sleep achieved, social situations navigated successfully, moments of peace carved from persistent anxiety. These invisible wounds required the same honor and recognition as visible scars, the same family support and community understanding. For the first time in 3 years, my family was seeing the complete picture of my military service, not just the heroic actions that earned medals, but the ongoing consequences that required courage every day. They were learning that recovery from trauma was not a destination but a journey, not something completed but something managed with dignity, support, and understanding. The Purple Heart Medal sat between us like a bridge between their old assumptions and new realities proof that invisible wounds deserved the same respect as visible sacrifice, that psychological courage was as worthy of honor as physical bravery under fire. When we emerged from the family support center, had concluded, but small groups of attendees lingered around the granite monument. The afternoon sun caught the gold lettering of the names, creating a warm glow that transformed the memorial from somber monument to beacon of remembrance. A local newspaper photographer was documenting the event, capturing images of families, touching names, veterans saluting, and community members reading the inscriptions with quiet reverence. I noticed him approach our group, then hesitate as he recognized the tension in our body language. The particular heaviness that follows difficult conversations and life-altering revelations. An elderly man in a wheelchair approached us, his VFW cap marking him as a Korean War veteran. His weathered hands gripped the armrests as he maneuvered closer, his eyes fixed on my dress uniform with the recognition that only comes from shared experience. "Staff Sergeant," he said, his voice carrying the particular respect that old soldiers show to those who have seen combat. "Frank Morrison, 2nd Infantry Division, Korea. I wanted to thank you for your service." The irony wasn't lost on me. This was Jim Morrison from my father's country club. The same man who had dismissed my military service as noble, I suppose, during their golf conversation months earlier. But here, in the presence of the memorial, and surrounded by the gravity of military sacrifice, his perspective had shifted completely. My father's face registered recognition and something approaching shame as he realized that the man offering respect to his son was the same person whose opinion had influenced his own embarrassment about my service. "Jim," my father said quietly, "this is my son, Marcus." Morrison's expression changed as he processed the family connection, understanding dawning in his eyes. "Your son?" "Robert, I had no idea when you mentioned he had served. I didn't realize." He gestured toward the memorial where my name was etched among the fallen heroes. "The Marcus Chen on the memorial. It's complicated," my father replied, his voice carrying the weight of 3 years' worth of misunderstanding that was only now being corrected. Before Morrison could respond, a woman in her 50s approached our group, her eyes bright with tears and recognition. She wore a small pin with a photograph of a young soldier, her son. I realized one of the 19 names represented on the memorial. "Excuse me," she said, her voice trembling with emotion. "Are you Staff Sergeant Chen?" I nodded, unsure of how she knew my name or why she was approaching. "My son was David Williams," she continued. "Corporal David Williams, 3rd Infantry Division. He was one of the soldiers you saved." The name hit me like electricity. Williams, the young soldier with the shattered leg who had kept trying to return to the fight. The kid from Nebraska who talked about his mother's apple pie and his girlfriend's letters. He had been one of the first wounded in the ambush, and I had personally carried him to the landing zone when the medevac finally arrived. "Mrs. Williams," I said, my voice thick with memory and gratitude for news I had never expected to receive. "How is David?" "He's alive because of you," she said, reaching into her purse to withdraw a photograph. "He's married now, has 2 children. He works for the post office back home, coaches Little League baseball. Has a full life because you refused to leave him behind." The photograph showed a man I barely recognized, older, healthier, smiling as he pushed a child on a swing set. This was what survival looked like. What the choice to stay behind and fight had purchased with my blood and trauma. "He wanted to be here today," Mrs. Williams continued, "but he couldn't. Seeing his name on a memorial, being reminded of that day, it's still difficult for him. But he asked me to find you, to tell you that not a day goes by that he doesn't. Think about your sacrifice." My family watched this interaction with growing amazement, understanding for the first time that my military service had real consequences, tangible results, lives saved that continued to unfold in ways they had never imagined. Other people began to approach family members of soldiers I had served with, veterans who had heard my story through military networks, community members who were learning about my presence for the first time. Each conversation revealed another facet of military service that transcended the simple narratives my family had constructed. "The newspaper wants to do a story," Sarah whispered, watching the photographer position himself nearby, about a local hero whose family didn't know the extent of his service. The idea made me uncomfortable, not because I was ashamed of my service, but because I wasn't sure my family was prepared for the public recognition that would follow. They were still processing revelations that had shattered 3 years of careful avoidance. A group of younger veterans approached, Men and women who had served in Iraq and Afghanistan, their bearing and confidence marking them as combat veterans, despite civilian clothes. One of them, a woman in her 30s, stepped forward with the easy familiarity of shared experience. Staff Sergeant Chen, I'm Lieutenant Rodriguez, 82nd Airborne. I served with some of the guys from your unit. They told me stories about October 15th. It's an honor to meet you. The informal military reunion that developed around the memorial created a community my family had never seen, veterans connecting across service branches and deployment dates, sharing stories and understanding that didn't require explanation or translation. They were witnessing the reality of military brotherhood, the bonds forged in shared danger and mutual sacrifice. We should have known, my mother said quietly, watching the interactions with a mixture of pride and regret. All these people know who you are, what you did. They understand your service in ways we never bothered to learn. The local newspaper clipping that would appear the following week was already being written in the photographer's mind. A story about community recognition, family reconciliation, and the hidden heroes living among us. But the real story was happening in real time, as my family witnessed the respect and gratitude that my military service had earned in communities I had never bothered to engage with. The contrast was stark and undeniable. While my own family had spent 3 years minimizing my service as just following orders, the military and veteran community had preserved and honored my story as an example of courage that transcended duty. The disconnect wasn't just about understanding, it was about values, priorities, and the willingness to engage with difficult realities rather than avoiding them. As the afternoon wore on and the crowd gradually dispersed, in possession of business cards, phone numbers, and invitations to veteran events they had never known existed, they were being welcomed into a community that had always been available to them. If they had chosen to participate rather than distance themselves from my military experience, the memorial ceremony had accomplished something that 3 years of gentle persuasion could never achieve. It had made my service visible, undeniable, worthy of recognition and respect. My family could no longer treat my military experience as a phase to be forgotten or a disappointment to be minimized. They were finally seeing me as the community had always seen me, not as someone who was just following orders, but as someone who had chosen heroism when heroism was required. The drive home from the memorial ceremony passed in contemplative silence, each of us processing revelations that had fundamentally altered our understanding of family, service, and the price of heroism. The late afternoon sun slanted through the car windows, creating patterns of light and shadow that seemed to mirror the complex emotions we were all struggling to navigate. At home, Father went immediately to his study and returned with a shoebox. I had never seen before worn cardboard held together with tape and marked with my name in my mother's careful handwriting. He set it on the kitchen table with the reverence usually reserved for legal evidence or family heirlooms. "We saved everything," he said quietly. "Every letter you sent, every email, every photograph. We told ourselves we were preserving your military service for posterity, but really we were trying to understand something we were too afraid to ask about directly." Inside the box were artifacts of 8 years of military service letters, written on military letterhead, photographs from deployment ceremonies, newspaper clippings about my unit's activities, but more significant were the items I had sent home over the years, mementos that told stories I had never been allowed to share. My mother withdrew a handful of letters from soldiers in my unit thank you notes. Holiday greetings, invitations to weddings and baptisms. These were the voices of men who had served under my leadership, soldiers whose lives had intersected with mine in ways that created lasting bonds. "Listen to this," she said, unfolding a letter from someone named Torres.
Dear Sergeant Chen,
"I wanted you to know that I made it through Ranger School. Your leadership and example during our deployment gave me the confidence to push myself beyond what I thought was possible. Thank you for believing in me when I didn't believe in myself." She read several more letters, each one revealing aspects of my military service that contradicted their narrative about following orders. These soldiers wrote about leadership, mentorship, inspiration characteristics that required initiative, judgment, and personal investment rather than simple obedience. "Why didn't you share these with us?" Sarah asked, holding a photograph of me with my unit. All of us grinning despite the dusty, austere backdrop of a forward operating base. "Because every time I tried to talk about my experiences, you changed the subject," I replied, not accusingly, but with the clarity that comes from finally being able to speak truth. You made it clear that military stories made you uncomfortable, that you preferred to focus on civilian achievements and future plans. My father found a commendation letter from my commanding officer, recommending me for promotion based on exceptional leadership under combat conditions and unwavering commitment to the welfare of soldiers under his command, the formal military. Language carried weight that casual conversation couldn't convey. This describes someone making independent decisions, taking initiative, accepting responsibility, he said, his lawyer's training helping him parse the significance of official documentation, not someone just following orders. The box contained other treasures, a coin from an Afghan provincial governor, thanking American forces for protecting civilian populations, a photograph of a school my unit had helped rebuild, a letter from a local interpreter whose life we had saved during a complex operation. These were tangible proof that military service had meaning beyond abstract duty, but the most significant items were at the bottom of the box: letters I had written home. During my deployments, correspondence they had saved but apparently never truly absorbed. My mother began reading excerpts, her voice growing stronger as she recognized themes and concerns she had missed the first time. From Afghanistan, March 2018, she read, The responsibility of leading these young soldiers weighs on me constantly. Every decision I make affects not just mission success, but human lives. Today I chose to disobey direct orders because I believed the intelligence was wrong and following orders would have gotten my people killed. It turned out I was right, but the weight of making those choices never gets easier. The letter contradicted everything they had believed about military service as mindless obedience. Here was documentary evidence that I had been making complex, moral decisions, accepting responsibility for consequences that could include court-martial if I judged incorrectly. You were telling us, my mother said, her voice thick with recognition and regret. You were trying to share your experiences, but we weren't listening. We were reading your letters like postcards from vacation rather than communications from someone grappling with life and death responsibilities. Another letter from my final deployment. I've been promoted again, which means more responsibility for training and mentoring newer soldiers. Some of these kids are barely 18, far from home for the first time, scared but trying to be brave. I remember what it felt like to be that young and uncertain. My job is to bring them home safely while completing missions that matter. The weight of that responsibility has changed me in ways I'm not sure I can explain to anyone who hasn't carried it. The letters revealed a progression from young soldier following orders to seasoned leader making decisions that affected dozens of lives. They documented transformation through responsibility, growth through adversity, leadership earned rather than assigned. We failed you, my father said, his voice heavy with the weight of 3 years' worth of missed opportunities. We failed. You, as parents, as family, as people who claimed to love you but couldn't be bothered to understand the most important experiences of your life. Sarah was reading a letter from my second deployment, where I had written about the complexity of counterinsurgency operations, the difficulty of distinguishing between civilians and combatants, the moral weight of decisions made with incomplete information and fatal consequences. You were trying to process trauma through writing, she said, her marketing background helping her recognize emotional communication strategies. You were reaching out for understanding, for connection, for family support to help you navigate impossible situations. Instead, we gave you polite responses and changed the subject at family dinners. My mother added, understanding now how thoroughly they had abandoned me during the times I most needed family connection. The shoebox of letters and photographs represented years of attempted communication, efforts to bridge the gap between military experience and civilian understanding that they had consistently rejected. I had tried to share the weight of command, the complexity of combat decisions, the pride and trauma of military service. They had responded with discomfort, avoidance, and ultimately the dismissive phrase that had haunted our relationship. Just following orders? How do we fix this? My father asked, the question carrying the desperate urgency of someone who understands that some damage might be irreversible. How do we make up for 3 years of not seeing you, not understanding you, not supporting you when you needed us most? The answer wasn't simple or immediate. Repair would require more than apologies. It would demand fundamental changes in how they approached military service, trauma, and the complex realities of family members whose experiences transcended their comfortable suburban understanding, but sitting at their kitchen table, surrounded by evidence of my military service that they had saved but never truly seen. I felt something I hadn't experienced in 3 years. Hoped that honest conversation might be possible. that family love might be strong enough to bridge the gap between their world and mine, the letters would remain on the table for weeks. Daily reminders of stories they had refused to hear and understanding they had declined to pursue. But now, they represented possibility rather than missed opportunity. Beginning of conversations that should have happened years earlier, family connections that might still be rebuilt with patience, honesty, and the courage to engage with difficult truths rather than avoiding them. 2 weeks after the memorial ceremony, my mother discovered something remarkable. While researching our family history for a genealogy project she had never bothered to complete, hidden in a trunk in the garage, beneath Christmas decorations and forgotten photo albums, she found a leather-bound book documenting for generations of military service in our family, a tradition they had somehow forgotten in their pursuit of civilian respectability. She brought the book to our first official family meeting, scheduled specifically to address the revelations from the memorial ceremony. We gathered in the living room on a Sunday afternoon, coffee and homemade cookies arranged on the table like peace offerings, the atmosphere careful but hopeful. "Your great-grandfather served in World War II," she began, opening the book to reveal black and white photographs of a young man in Army uniform. Pacific Theater, Philippines campaign. He was awarded a Bronze Star for valor. The photograph showed a face I recognized in my own features, the same serious expression, the same steady gaze that appeared in my military portraits. But this was family history they had never shared, military heritage they had somehow erased from their narrative about appropriate career choices. "And your grandfather," she continued, turning the page to reveal another uniformed figure, served in Korea, combat engineer, built bridges, and cleared mines. He came home with shrapnel in his leg that bothered him for the rest of his life. Sarah leaned forward, studying the photographs with new interest. "I remember Grandpa limping sometimes, but I never knew it was for military service. Why didn't anyone ever talk about this?" "Because by the time you were born, we had decided that military service was something previous generations did out of necessity," my father replied, his voice carrying the weight of recognition. "We wanted you to have choices we thought were better education, professional careers, financial security that didn't depend on government service." The family military history book contained more revelations in Coles, who had served in Vietnam, cousins who had joined the Navy, complex web of military service that contradicted their narrative about our family's civilian values. They had systematically ignored or minimized military tradition in favor of promoting academic and professional achievement. "We didn't just dismiss your service," my mother said, her voice thick with understanding. "We dismissed our entire family heritage. All the sacrifices that previous generations made to protect the freedoms we enjoyed." I studied the photographs of relatives I had never known were veterans, understanding for the first time that my decision to enlist wasn't a rejection of family values, but a continuation of family tradition. The choice that they had seen as rebellious was actually deeply conservative and erring patterns of service that stretched back generations. "Why did you stop talking about military service?" I asked, genuinely curious about the family dynamics that had led to such systematic erasure of military heritage. "Vietnam," my father replied simply. "Your grandfather came home from Korea a hero, but by the time Vietnam ended, military service was controversial, divisive. We wanted to avoid political arguments, social complications. It seemed easier to focus on achievements that everyone could celebrate without reservation." The explanation revealed how historical trauma had shaped their family's relationship with military service. They had witnessed the way society had treated Vietnam veterans, the protests, the accusations, the lack of welcome home parades. Their protective instincts had led them to discourage military service rather than risk exposing their children to social rejection. But times changed, Sarah observed, her marketing instincts recognizing shifts in public opinion. Military service regained respect, especially after 9/11s. We could have adapted our attitudes, but we were trapped by our own prejudices. The conversation continued for hours, touching on subjects we had avoided for 3 years. They asked about my military friends, my deployment experiences, my reasons for choosing the infantry over safer military occupational specialties. 4. The first time, they listened without judgment or attempts to redirect the conversation toward more comfortable topics. "Tell us about the men you saved," my mother said, her voice gentle but direct. "We know their names from the official reports, but what were they like as people?" The request opened floodgates of memory I had kept sealed for years. I told them about Martinez, the youngest soldier in our unit, who carried his girlfriend's photograph in his helmet and dreamed of opening a restaurant when he returned home. It's about Williams, whose sense of humor had kept morale high during the worst moments of deployment. About Jackson, the team medic, who had risked his life repeatedly to treat wounded soldiers under fire. They weren't statistics or casualties, I explained. They were friends, brothers, young men, with families and dreams and futures that were preserved because I chose to stay behind and fight. My father listened with the focused attention he brought to important testimony, asking follow-up questions. That demonstrated genuine interest rather than polite obligation. How do you process the responsibility of making life-and-death decisions? How do you sleep at night knowing that other people's survival depended on your choices? The questions were difficult, but necessary, acknowledging the psychological weight of military leadership that civilian experience couldn't prepare anyone to understand. For the first time, my family was engaging with the complexity of military service rather than reducing it to simple concepts about duty and obedience. Sometimes I don't sleep, I admitted. Sometimes I replay every decision, wondering if I could have saved everyone, brought everyone home. The responsibility never really goes away, just becomes part of who you are. Sarah asked about the transition to civilian life. The challenges of finding meaning in work that felt trivial compared to military responsibilities. How do you go from leading soldiers in combat to filling out job applications for security positions? How do you find purpose in civilian work? Her questions revealed understanding that had been missing for 3 years, recognition that military service created expectations and standards that civilian life struggled to match. The jobs I had applied for weren't stepping stones to better careers. They were attempts to find work that honored skills and experiences that had no civilian equivalent. The family military history book remained open between us throughout the conversation, photographs of uniformed relatives serving as silent witnesses to traditions we were finally acknowledging. Each image represented choices made by previous generations to serve something larger than personal advancement. Sacrifices that had protected freedoms my immediate family had taken for granted. As the afternoon wore on, I began to understand that healing wasn't just about them learning to appreciate my service. It was about rebuilding family connections that honored both military tradition and civilian achievement, values that complemented rather than competed with each other. We want to do better, my mother said as our conversation drew to a close. We want to understand, to support, to be the family you deserved when you came home. The commitment felt genuine but tentative, acknowledgement that change would require sustained effort rather than good intentions. 3 years of distance couldn't be erased through single conversations, but the family military history book suggested that foundations for understanding had always existed, waiting to be rediscovered and honored 6 months after the memorial ceremony. My family attended my formal Silver Star presentation at the Pasadena Veterans Administration facility. The ceremony took place in a modern auditorium filled with veterans, their families, and community leaders who understood the significance of military honors earned through extraordinary sacrifice. I stood at attention in my dress blue uniform, the same one I had worn to the memorial ceremony, but this time the ribbons and badges felt like authentic representations of my service. Rather than costumes from a life my family couldn't understand, the Silver Star Medal, the nation's third highest decoration for valor, would be presented for actions that had once been too classified, too complex, too painful for my family to comprehend. In the front row, my parents sat with the quiet dignity they had learned during months of family conversations about military service, sacrifice, and the true meaning of heroism. My mother wore a small pin with my photograph and uniform, not out of obligation, but from genuine pride in service. She finally understood. My father carried himself with the bearing of someone who had learned to see military achievement as equal to civilian success. Sarah had brought her children, my nephew and niece, ages 8 and 10, to witness the ceremony. She wanted them to understand that their uncle's military service was family history worth preserving and honoring, a tradition that connected them to previous generations of veterans who had served with distinction. Tell us again about Uncle Marcus's medal, my nephew whispered to Sarah as we waited for the ceremony to begin. He saved 23 soldiers, she replied, her voice carrying the pride that had been missing for too many years. He chose to stay behind and fight so that other people could go home to their families. The explanation was simple enough for children to understand, but profound enough to capture the essence of military sacrifice. My family had learned to talk about my service without minimizing its significance, to honor achievements that transcended civilian metrics of success. Major General Patricia Williams, commanding general of the local reserve component, delivered remarks about the significance of the Silver Star and the extraordinary circumstances that warranted its presentation. Her words carried the authority of someone who understood military leadership, combat decision-making, and the price of heroism under fire. Staff Sergeant Chen's actions on October 15, 2019, exemplify the highest traditions of military service, she said, her voice resonating throughout the auditorium. Faced with impossible odds and certain death, he chose duty over survival, sacrifice over safety, service over self. His courage saved 23 lives and embodies the very best of American military tradition. When my name was called, I approached the podium with the measured pace military ceremonies require. The medal itself was beautifully Silver Star suspended from a blue ribbon, representing valor that went beyond the call of duty, but more meaningful was the presence of my family, their faces reflecting pride and understanding that had been years in the making. "It is my honor," General Williams said, "to present the Silver Star to Staff Sergeant Marcus Chen for conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity in action against an enemy of the United States." As she pinned the medal to my uniform, I thought about the journey that had brought us to this moment, from family embarrassment about my military service to genuine appreciation for sacrifice they finally understood. The transformation hadn't been easy or automatic. It had required sustained effort, honest conversations, and willingness to engage with difficult truths rather than avoiding them. After the ceremony, we gathered for a reception where military families shared stories and celebrated achievements that civilian society often overlooked. My family moved through these conversations with comfort they had learned through months of attending veteran events, supporting military families, and engaging with communities they had previously ignored. Mrs. Williams, the mother of Corporal David Williams, one of the soldiers I had saved, approached our family with news that completed circles we hadn't known were incomplete. "David is here," she said, gesturing toward a man in his 30s who was approaching with careful steps and obvious nervousness. He wanted to finally meet the family of the man who saved his life. The introduction was emotional for everyone involved. David Williams carried visible reminders of that day in Afghanistan: a slight limp from his shattered leg, scars on his hands from shrapnel, the careful way he moved that suggested ongoing physical therapy. But he also carried photographs of his children, stories about his work, evidence of a life made possible by decisions I had made under fire. "I think about that day often," he told my family, his voice steady despite obvious emotion. "Not just the attack, but the choice your son made to stay behind. He could have left with us, but he chose to fight so we could live." My parents listened, with the focused attention they had learned to bring to military stories. No longer uncomfortable with tales of combat and sacrifice, they were beginning to understand that such stories weren't traumatic burdens to be avoided, but sacred narratives that deserved preservation and honor. The reception continued with conversations that would have been impossible 6 months earlier. My family engaged with Gold Star mothers, combat veterans, military spouses, communities that had always been available to them if they had chosen participation over distance. As the day concluded, we gathered for a new family portrait at the etched memorial where this transformation had begun. The photographer captured 5 people whose relationships had been fundamentally altered by truth-telling, honest conversation, and willingness to engage with realities that were uncomfortable but necessary in the photograph. I wear my dress uniform with newly awarded decorations, but the real change is visible in my family's faces, expressions that reflect pride rather than embarrassment, understanding rather than avoidance, love that encompasses rather than despite my military service. The portrait would replace the old family photograph on my mother's mantle, representing not just a moment in time, but a fundamental shift in how we understood family loyalty, military service, and the courage required to honor truth over comfort. That evening, over dinner at their house, my father raised his wine glass in a toast that would have been impossible before the memorial ceremony. "To Marcus," he said, his voice carrying the weight of recognition that had been years delayed but was finally genuine. Not just for his service to our country, but for his patience with a family that took too long to understand that heroism comes in many forms. That following orders was never an adequate description for the choices he made under fire. Toast acknowledged not just my military achievements, but their own growth as family members, who had learned to see military service as worthy of respect, understanding, and pride. The journey from just following orders to genuine appreciation for sacrifice had required courage from all of us, courage to tell difficult truths, to admit failures, to rebuild relationships on foundations of honesty rather than comfortable fiction, as we shared dinner and conversation that honored both military tradition and civilian achievement. I understood that healing was possible when families chose engagement over avoidance, truth over comfort, understanding over ignorance. The memorial ceremony had forced revelations that should have happened naturally, but the outcome was the same. A family finally united in honoring service that had always been worthy of respect. 1 year later, we returned to the memorial for the first annual remembrance ceremony, but this time as a family transformed by truth, understanding, and the hard work of rebuilding relationships that honor both military service and civilian achievement. The morning was crisp and clear, with October sunlight dancing across the polished granite surface that had revealed so many hidden truths about sacrifice and heroism. My family had reserved a place near the front, not out of obligation or social expectation, but because this memorial had become sacred ground for us. The place where comfortable lies had been shattered and difficult truths had finally been acknowledged. They brought flowers, American flags, and the quiet dignity they had learned during a year of attending veteran events and supporting military families. The memorial bench had been installed 3 months earlier, a simple granite seat positioned, where families could sit in quiet reflection while reading the names of local heroes. The plaque on the bench read, "In honor of all who served and the families who support them. Donated by the Chen family, with gratitude for service and sacrifice." The bench represented more than financial contribution. It symbolized their commitment to understanding military service as worthy of ongoing honor, rather than polite acknowledgement. They had learned that supporting veterans required sustained engagement, not just ceremonial appearances. Sarah's children, now comfortable with their uncle's military stories, placed small flowers at the base of the memorial while reading names. Aloud with the reverence children show to important family traditions. They understood that military service was part of their heritage, something to be honored rather than hidden. "Uncle Marcus's name is still there," my niece observed, pointing to the gold lettering that declared me among the fallen heroes, even though he came home. "Because part of him did die that day," my mother explained gently, using language we had developed during family conversations about trauma, sacrifice, and transformation through military service. The boy who left for the military became a man through experiences that changed him forever. The explanation was accurate and age-appropriate, acknowledging that military service involves loss even when soldiers survive physically. My family had learned to honor both the person I had been and the person I had become, understanding that transformation through trauma deserved respect rather than attempts to restore pre-service normalcy. As the ceremony began, I noticed familiar faces throughout the crowd, veterans I now worked with through my position at the VA, family members of soldiers I had saved, community members who had learned to see military service as worthy of ongoing support rather than annual recognition. My work with the Veterans Administration had grown from part-time counseling to full-time coordination of family support programs. The position allowed me to help other veterans navigate the challenges of civilian reintegration while supporting families who struggled to understand military experience. The work was meaningful in ways that civilian employment had never been, utilizing skills and experiences that had no equivalent in the private sector. Colonel Martinez, now retired but still active in veteran affairs, approached our family with news that completed another circle of understanding. "The Chen Family Military Heritage Scholarship has been approved," he announced, referring to an educational fund my parents had established to support children of military families pursuing higher education. The first recipients will be announced next month. Scholarship represented their evolving understanding of military service as worthy of investment, rather than simple acknowledgement. They had learned that supporting veterans required more than individual family reconciliation. It demanded community engagement and systematic support for military families facing challenges they had once been unwilling to understand. During the ceremony, I was invited to speak about the memorial's significance and the ongoing needs of veteran families. Standing at the podium where revelations had begun 1 year earlier, I looked out at an audience that included not just military families, but civilian community members who had learned to see veteran issues as community responsibilities. "This memorial represents more than the names etched in granite," I said, my voice carrying across the gathered crowd. "It represents the ongoing commitment we make to honor service, support families, and bridge the gap between military and civilian communities." My family listened with the focused attention they had learned to bring to military subjects. No longer uncomfortable with stories about combat, sacrifice, and the complex realities of veteran reintegration, they had become advocates rather than passive observers, understanding that military families needed sustained support rather than ceremonial recognition. After the ceremony, we walked through the memorial park, where additional monuments honored different aspects of military service: Gold Star Families Memorial, a prisoner of war remembrance, a monument to military working dogs. Each edition reflected the community's growing understanding that military service involved diverse forms of sacrifice that deserved specific recognition. The afternoon concluded with our traditional family dinner, but the conversation had evolved far beyond the careful avoidance that had characterized our interactions for 3 years. They asked about my work with veteran families, my own ongoing therapy and recovery, the challenges and successes of bridging military and civilian communities. "How do we make sure other families don't make the mistakes we made?" my father asked, his question reflecting genuine concern about military families facing similar challenges of understanding and communication. "By talking honestly about military service," I replied. "By acknowledging that it involves sacrifice, trauma, and transformation that civilian experience can't prepare families to understand. By choosing engagement over avoidance, even when conversations are difficult." As evening approached, I walked outside to the backyard where I had spent so many solitary hours during my difficult reintegration. But this time, my family joined me not out of obligation, but from genuine desire to share space that had once symbolized my isolation from there. Understanding, we sat together as the sun set behind the San Gabriel Mountains, painting the sky in colors that reminded me of dawn patrols in Afghanistan but no longer triggered anxiety or hypervigilance. The sounds of suburbia sprinklers, distant traffic, children playing had become comfort rather than reminders of displacement. "Do you ever regret it?" Sarah asked quietly. "The choice you made that day, knowing what it cost you?" The question was one I had wrestled with during 2 years of rehabilitation and 3 years of difficult reintegration. The honest answer was complex, acknowledging both the price of heroism and the meaning found in sacrifice that transcended personal cost. "Regret that it was necessary," I said, watching shadows lengthen across the lawn where we had played as children. "I regret that 23 young men were put in danger by circumstances beyond their control. But I don't regret choosing their lives over my own comfort, their futures over my safety." My mother reached over and squeezed my hand, a gesture that acknowledged understanding she had been unable or unwilling to provide for too many years. "We're proud of you," she said simply. "Not just for what you did that day, but for your patience with us, your willingness to forgive our failures, your commitment to helping other families avoid our mistakes." The words carried weight that couldn't be achieved through ceremony or public recognition. Family pride, genuinely earned and honestly expressed, meant more than medals or monuments because it represented love that had grown to encompass truth rather than requiring comfortable fiction. As darkness settled over Pasadena, I understood that the memorial ceremony had accomplished something beyond individual family reconciliation. It had connected military and civilian communities in ways that honored service while supporting families, creating networks of understanding that transcended the isolation many veterans experienced during reintegration. The bronze memorial plaque would endure for generations, my name forever linked to 19 other local heroes who had made ultimate sacrifices in service to their country. But the more important legacy was sitting around me in the gathering darkness of family that had learned to honor military service without requiring heroes to minimize their experiences, to bridge civilian and military communities without losing respect for either. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, families struggling with reintegration, community members learning to support military service, young people considering military careers despite civilian family pressure. But tonight, sitting in the backyard of my childhood home, surrounded by family who had learned to see military service as worthy of pride rather than embarrassment, I felt something I hadn't experienced since before that October morning in Afghanistan: complete peace. The memorial bench would be there for future families to discover, offering a place for reflection and remembrance that honored service, while supporting those who continued the mission of caring for veterans and their loved ones. And somewhere in the city, other families were having conversations they had previously avoided, learning to bridge gaps between military and civilian experience with the courage that honor requires. The phrase "just following orders" had been replaced by understanding that true military service transcends duty, that heroism involves choice, and that families strong enough to embrace difficult truths are strong enough to honor sacrifice that goes far beyond simple obedience. In the end, that transformation from comfortable avoidance to courageous engagement was a victory worth every moment of struggle it had required.